Good evening and welcome to the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. Thank you for joining us for today's discussion. My name is Andy Zemanides. I'm the Executive Director of the Hellenic American Leadership Council. I'm also an Emerging Leaders alum here at the Chicago Council and have the privilege of serving on the Council's board. The Council examines the most pressing challenges shaping our world, and tonight we're going to focus on how Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine has fundamentally transformed European security and really shaping the definition of East versus West. Europe has been forced to make hard choices and changes, ending decades of energy dependence on Russia, significantly increasing defense spending, and rethinking its engagement across the former Soviet Union. These decisions and these policy choices have implications far beyond Europe. They're reshaping the global balance of power and also reshaping how we understand East versus West, global North versus global South. How will Europe navigate this new reality? What does strategic autonomy actually mean when put into practice? What does this mean for the transatlantic relationship? We're fortunate to have an exceptional panel with us tonight to explore these questions. Alexander Cooley, Liana Fix, Eleanor Lazaro, and Rachel Rizzo. Somehow we managed to get three people with Greek American and Greek roots. It must have been a favor to me. Along with our moderator for this evening, Council President and CEO, Leslie Vinjamorny. Please join me in welcoming our all-star panel.
Good evening and welcome. And Andy, thank you so much for that fabulous introduction. It's lovely to see everybody tonight. It's quite an extraordinary time for so many reasons, and I'm sure our panelists are going to tell us about some of those. This is a really special group of phenomenal people when it comes to their level of engagement, scholarship, writing, speaking, traveling, you name it, and they're just also terrific people. One of the best parts of my new role is working with the home team to really bring not only phenomenal people, but really great, nice, engaging people to Chicago. So thank you, first of all of you, for being here and for making the trip, because they're also extremely busy and in high demand. As you heard from Andy, we have a panel of individuals who are European, some of them who know a lot about Europe contextually, who also have a lot to say about the global South. And we sort of had a few moments backstage where we said, wow, where do we focus? And obviously the home team has really given us a lot of thought on that. But, you know, there are sort of a couple of things. There is the war in Ukraine that is also has clearly shaped and, as Andy said, really challenged different parts of Europe to decide where they stand and what they're going to do. There is a different U.S. administration in terms of the signaling about what its commitment is to different parts of Europe and to its engagement on the question of the defense of Ukraine. And then there are all sorts of internal European questions as well. So there's a lot on the table, and we're going to try to come to some of those questions. We're not going to give big introductions because we've got a lot of speakers, but I do encourage you not only to take a look at their biographies, but also to read their publications and to listen to their work. I'm going to start with the two Europeans in the room who also know a lot about the United States, but one of you lives in the United States. But I think that given we're talking about Europe, it's a great idea to start with those of you who are based in Europe. Elena Lazarou, you are Director General of the Hellenic Foundation for European and Foreign Policy. It's a new leadership role for you. They're very lucky to have you. We're really thrilled to see you in the role. You were also an associate fellow at Chatham House for a long time and at the European Parliament's Research Service for a very long time, leading a significant part of that, which is how I came to know you. Tell us about Europe. How is Europe internally dividing on the question of the war in Ukraine? If you could sort of walk us through East versus West, is that a way, we tend so often to focus on Western Europe, on NATO. I know you know a lot about this, but when you've looked at Europe as a whole, how do you see the divisions within Europe, the different perceptions of Russia, of the war in Ukraine? Could you give us sort of a roadmap for starting?
Thank you very much, Leslie, for the question, but also for the invitation. And I think it's my first opportunity to say on stage, congratulations on your new role, although it's been a while. It's been amazing to follow the work that's been done. It's great to be here with the friends and colleagues, and thank you to Endis Amenidis as well, who opened this conference. Very good to be here. Now, before I talk about, and I'm going to be short, about how the war in Ukraine is dividing Europe, I want to say a couple of words about how it's uniting Europe, because I do want to set that context. I think we need to be balanced in that sense. So just a couple of reminders. 2019, the EU decided to take up its new identity as a geopolitical actor. That was the big narrative. And that sort of had collective buy-in from all EU member states, north, south, west, east. And it meant a couple of things. It meant that the European Union would be more cohesive, working together on issues like defense, like energy. We saw a number of initiatives. We saw groundbreaking things for us Europeans, which were like some things like the EU budget being committed to parts of defense industrial development. So there was a momentum there to do more together, to unite on the basis of defense and geopolitics. So that's where we were coming from in 2022 when Russia invaded Ukraine. And at first, because of that prequel of doing more together on defense, the first response was uniting on sanctions, on which we've now had 19 packages of sanctions by the EU on Russia, uniting on investing more in defense industrial production, uniting on supporting Ukraine through financial but also military means, uniting and working together with the United States, with the United Kingdom, G7, on all of these issues. So there was the moment of uniting. And obviously, there was behind that, there was a big impetus and sort of dynamism from the eastern flank of the EU, which was closer to the theater of the war, which was directly threatened by Russia. So we saw a lot of the momentum coming, and there was a lot of talk about the momentum and the moment of Eastern European member states becoming the agenda-setting part of it. Now, we are in 2025. I think many of us did not expect this war would last this long. But of course, the cracks start showing as the financial, but also the political implications of that support become more evident, more robust, and we see that in the economies, but also the politics of member states. East-West is an easy division to make, but for me, it's more of an East-South, what we're seeing right now. So if I were to look at the geography of the EU vis-a-vis the war, we have one group of member states, which is the eastern flank, the eastern member states, and I would add there also Finland by its proximity to Russia, which is they're directly threatened by Russia. It's not just about hybrid threats as for the rest of the EU. It's about directly feeling the threat of potential invasion, of potential violation of their sovereignty. And there we have the momentum of continued support, investing in supporting Ukraine as ever before. We have Western European member states, Western EU member states, where I think issues that we see going forward because of Russia's war in Ukraine, such as ramping up defense industrial production, supporting that defense industrial base, which is very much based in some of those states, is advantageous, and it also leads to that prospect of strategic autonomy that President Macron has spoken a lot about. So there's that. But then we have a whole group of states in the south which I think are increasingly manifesting the fact that, yes, they are in for the support to Ukraine, but there are things happening. There are things happening in Africa. There are things happening in sub-Saharan Africa with implications for the Mediterranean. There are things happening in the Middle East, and these are priorities for those member states. And what we're seeing essentially is an effort to find the moments and the ways in which we can reconcile the security interests of the different member states in terms of capability building, solidarity, mutual assistance, guarantees. This is all feeding into a debate, and I think what needs to be done and the way forward is if support to Ukraine will continue being unified, there needs to be a more strategic outlook on how the EU deals with the theaters south and west. So I'll stop here, but this is sort of my outline. It's a big question.
It is a big question, and it's fascinating. And I think you didn't talk about the U.S.
Well, we were asked.
You don't know, but
I
no, you weren't asked to talk about the U.S. But it is interesting, right? Because it's just a reminder of how profound the impacts have been on Europe and how deep internal across Europe the conversation is. I think sometimes in the United States we forget that it's not all about us. It's not all about us, right? We know at the Chicago Council, and probably everybody dialed in, but I'm not sure that we always in the United States recognize the depth and the significance of the things that are now happening in Europe. Let me turn to you, Liana Fix. You are from Germany. You are based in Washington, D.C. You are Senior Fellow for Europe at the Council on Foreign Relations. You've done excellent research, writing, convening on the topic of Germany, on Europe, on Russia and Ukraine. Tell us about Germany. I mean, I think in the early days, it feels like a very long time ago now, but in the early days, we were transfixed by what felt like Germany was completely transforming so many of the fundamental bases for how it understood its role in security in Europe with respect to Russia, with questions of energy dependence. Has there been follow through? How has Germany changed? How has Europe divided or unified on the question of energy? And anything else that you might wish to say by way of introduction?
Thanks so much, Leslie. I think you would have guessed that I'm German by my accent by now. So thanks so much for the opportunity to be here. I love to talk about Germany also because there's a shameless plug. I will have a book about Germany's return to military power coming out next year, which is also what I would present as an answer to your question. I know there has been a lot of disappointment initially with Germany. You all might have heard about what was called in Germany the Zeitenwende, a changing of times, a big speech by then Social Democratic Chancellor Olaf Scholz in 2022 that finally Germany has to abandon the kind of myth of pacifism that it has pursued for so long and return to military power. Well, there was a lot of disappointment with that, which is, from my perspective, the reason why right now there's not a lot of attention being paid to the fact that this is fundamentally changing. That at the beginning of this year, the new German government has made unprecedented steps in defense spending, which will lead Germany projected to have a defense spending in 2029 that will be as big as the current French and British defense spending combined, 150 billion in defense spending, right? So that is remarkable. That is a remarkable transformation of Germany. It took a long time, but it also raises a couple of questions, obviously, for the balance of Europe. Those of you who remember these debates, especially in Cold War times, at German reunification, will remember those questions about, well, what if Germany becomes too powerful? Other countries like France and Poland also do remember that question. So if we look at the trajectory of European military spending, there needs to be solutions found for Germany that if it continues this path, if the populism threat that is there in Germany, but also in other countries in France, continues, that will make sure that other countries such as Poland will feel protected by this powerful Germany and not threatened. That's sort of the first point of the current European situation. My second point is that I would argue, and Ellen has described this perfectly, that Europeans, especially those closer to the front lines on the eastern flank, right now are in a new chapter in their relations with Russia, and I would say since September this year. You might have heard about Russian gray zone activity, hybrid tactics, drones, Russian jets being in NATO airspace. Rachel will talk more about that. But this has really been, for Europeans, not gray zone tactics, as you would call those. These are dark gray tactics, right? This is unprecedented Russian interference in European airspace. And that has contributed much to converging the interests of Europeans, bringing Europeans together, because for the first time, they do not only feel threatened by Russia in a way which was not the case before. We have never seen such Russian activities since the beginning of the war. This is the first time Russia feels so encouraged, so unhinged to do what it is doing. And that obviously relates on the other side, and you said it, Leslie, to fear by Europeans that Russia is doing it because it wants to show and it wants Europeans to realize from a Russian perspective that NATO is fake, that the United States will not come to the help of Europeans, that if they dare to shoot down a Russian jet, they will be on their own. If you talk to European diplomats these days in Washington, D.C., the one question that they will ask is, will the United States keep its troops in Europe? There's a review ongoing in the Pentagon about how many troops will stay globally and in the European theater. That is a real fear that is currently dominating Europe. It's not only the fear of Vladimir Putin, but it really is the fear, how can we defend ourselves between Putin and Trump? And closing the loop to Germany, I would argue that it was actually Trump who has done much more for Germany's rearmament than Vladimir Putin has done. It really was, and that was a great investigative book by a German journalist argued that Chancellor Friedrich Merz was actually convinced by a source in Washington that the US president might announce an abandonment of NATO in his Congress speech in March 2025, and therefore rushed through an unprecedented reform of the German debt brake, which is why Germany can now spend so much on defense debt finance. So again, the fear of US abandonment is the much greater fear even than the fear of Russia.
Thank you. I think for many people, there's a question about whether that fear of abandonment will be enough, whether it will be enough to kind of force these changes to have staying power, whether the aspiration will be met, and it's that fear of abandonment presumably is it's not clear because President Trump's position has changed over time, and it continues to be hard to kind of pin down. Elena and I were both at the Warsaw Security Forum just a few weeks ago, and there was a lot of talk about gray zone tactics. You're the first person that said dark gray, but it was very clear that this is sort of where the conversation is. This is where the concern is. We heard conversation about Europe needs to take a much more offensive position when it comes to countering or offending on the gray zone tactics. But it's clear that there isn't a comprehensive strategy yet for what does one do about this. But it is a very serious moment of crisis. Rachel Rizzo, you are non-resident senior fellow at the Europe Center and at the Atlantic Council. You are headed to India before long, because you also do a lot of work on India and Europe. You are on many platforms. Your writing is tremendous, as well as your Substack. I want to ask you the question about deterrence and the perspective from Russia. I guess the question is, do you think that Russia feels deterred? I mean, they don't seem to behave in a way that suggests that they're concerned about the fact that Germany is spending more, that Europe has a lot more cohesion, even for its internal divisions, that the U.S. is still in the game, even if the rhetoric isn't always there. We haven't seen the troops taken away yet. There is still some spending at some moments. There have been questions about Tomahawk missiles. That didn't happen, but who knows? It might come back. Does Russia feel deterred, or gray zone tactics? Are they perceiving an absence of commitment and unity?
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, I just want to echo everyone else's thanks for the invitation. My dad was born and raised in downtown Chicago, so deep ties to the city, and it's great to be here. I think in terms of how Russia views NATO's deterrent effect, I think the fact that NATO has been the strongest military alliance in the world for what is coming on 77 years is it is effective in that way, and that's a clear display that there is a deterrent effect there. But where that deterrent effect comes from, I think, is the big question. Because for many years, the ultimate guarantor of Europe's security and the power behind NATO has lied within the power of the United States and the presence that it has and has had on the European continent, both economically but also militarily. And so I think a good place to start with this question today is in the Global Force Posture Review, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's the Defense Department is basically looking at where U.S. troops are deployed around the world. And there is a lot of anxiety that once that Global Force Posture Review comes out, it was supposed to come out a couple months ago, then it was this month, and then it's next month, it keeps getting pushed back, that the result of that will be a decrease in U.S. force presence on the European continent. Now, I don't think the result of that is going to be as bad as people might think it is for Europe, but there's real anxiety in Europe about what the outcome of this Global Force Posture Review might be for a couple reasons. The first is what it means for the historical paradigm that the transatlantic relationship has rested on, which is what I already described. But the second source of anxiety, I think, really stems from the fact that what I said before, the deterrence effect of NATO really lies in the United States. It's why, for example, when it comes to questions about NATO's enhanced forward presence, these brigade and battalion-sized forces that they have in the Baltics and Poland, it's so important to have European troops there as a tripwire. In Russia's mind, threatening a battalion made up of Lithuanian and Estonian and Polish soldiers looks a lot different once you add American soldiers to the mix. So I think going forward, Europe really needs to be able to grow its military efficiencies in a way that provides the same deterrent effect that the United States has provided thus far in terms of imposing potential costs on the Russian military should it choose to challenge Europe in that way. And so far today, I fear that those costs that Europe is able to impose are still far too low. But I think this is why conversations about European capabilities are so important. And it's so important for the United States to support Europe when it talks about strengthening its own defense industrial base, building its own defense capabilities, not because they're fearful that the United States will abandon them, but because at the end of the day, it's good for Europe to have those abilities as well, especially as Liana was talking about in the face of gray zone tactics, in the face of Russia testing NATO's deterrence in terms of flying drones over Poland, flying jets over Estonia. These are things that aren't new. We've been dealing with them for years. But I think for Europe to have the ability to deal with that is going to be really important.
I want to ask you one specific question before I come to Alex, and that is, why do you think that the serious question, right? Why do you think that the Global Force Posture Review has been delayed? Do you think it's lack of capacity? Do you think it's distraction? Or do you think that it's a genuine ambivalence about what should be done? That the actual kind of calibration of how to deploy America's capabilities is shifting?
My guess is that there's disagreements within the Trump administration about what the Global Force Posture Review should end up saying. And I don't know, that's just me sort of reading the tea leaves. I'm not sure if that's what's going on. But I do know that there are differing opinions between policymakers within the Trump team about where they think the U.S. should prioritize things militarily. Is it the Indo-Pacific region? Most people look at that region as the most militarily significant in terms of just like force projection, and I think that makes sense. But there's also people, I think, who still are tried and true transatlanticists, although they're very drowned out amongst all of the noise. And so I do think that there's perhaps not a agreed upon outlook about what this should actually say, and there's still some back and forth being worked out in terms of what the outcome is going to be.
And could it be part of a negotiation? Maybe we can come back to this.
Yeah.
But maybe no.
Yeah.
Is it something that's being held as a negotiating tool?
Well, it was last time, remember? I mean, in the first Trump term, he said that they were going to pull 12,500 troops out of Germany and send them east to Poland because Poland was a model ally spending more on defense than Germany was. So you never know. They do use these things as sort of a negotiating tactic.
Alex Cooley, you're based in New York. You're a professor. You've run the famous Harriman Institute at Columbia University for many years. You've written many books. But most importantly, you are on the stage for the first time as a non-resident senior fellow for Eurasia Affairs here at the Chicago Council. Welcome to your new role, which you're doing alongside, of course, your professorial roles in New York City. But we're delighted to have you at the Chicago Council. I want to turn to you as a scholar of Central Asia, of geopolitics. You know a lot about Georgia, Moldova. There is a whole other part of Europe and Central Asia which has been deeply impacted by the war in Ukraine, threatened presumably in very different ways, different alignments with other parts of Europe. Give us the lay of the land.
Yeah, thank you, Leslie. It's a pleasure to be here with such real experts and commentators, and also to be part of this now storied institution. It's a real thrill, so thank you. So Central Asia is interesting, both in its own right and the fact that it tells us about some of the stories and complications that this war has brought up beyond the immediate West versus Russia axis, right? So when I talk about post-Soviet Central Asia, I mean Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and we can also talk about the Caucasus, Armenia, Georgia, Azerbaijan. The expectation after the war started was that these states would express their solidarity with Ukraine, right? Amongst Western policymakers, intel folks, analysts, and this was actually surprising to me, given that in 2014, when Russia annexed Ukraine at the United Nations, all the Central Asian states either abstained in their vote or just didn't vote. They forgot to vote. Something else was going on. Maybe they were having lunch in Midtown or so forth. I think the lesson was they did not want to take a stand on this, right? And I saw no reason why this wasn't going to be the case, right? Pragmatic neutrality. Why is this? Well, first, yes, there are concerns about Ukrainian sovereignty. All of these states value their sovereignty, right, and their territorial integrity. They're all concerned that Russian military bases that are stationed on their territory could be used, deployed. However, on the other side, Russia has a lot of influence in these places. Influence like a vast ecosystem of media, economic ties, and perhaps most important, migration ties. There are millions of Central Asian migrants who work in Russia, construction workers, domestic caregivers, different kinds of jobs throughout the country. And so these are all levers of influence, for one. Security services between the two countries, very tight. What we didn't see is what happened after the war, which is while Ukraine and its Western allies were saying, this is the moment that we extricate from Russia, right? We're going to decolonize from Russia, right? Central Asia was becoming re-entangled with Russia, right? I'll give you two quick examples. First was people. Tens of thousands of laid off Russian IT workers, right? Meta, Google, all these companies that were banned, flee Russia. Where do they go to? They go to places where they can go quickly, but they don't need visas, right? And that's Central Asia. That's Armenia, Georgia. Here's one of my favorite facts of this. Armenian GDP in 2022 was projected to rise by 1%. It rose by 11. What was the difference? the Russian IT sector, right? Coming in and basing itself in Armenia. So there was this re-entanglement of people. Also, the mobilization of the Russian draft sent people, again, going wherever they could without visas. That was one. But second, there was economic opportunity in the war. And you're going to say, okay, that's really kind of a weird thing to say, Cooley. So sanctions imposed by about 20 Western countries, right, were not imposed by sort of the Central Asian countries. And they have all been part of an intricate set of networks enabling sanctions evasion, right? This includes designating goods for re-export, right? They go into Kyrgyzstan and then they're shipped off to Russia under the customs union of the Eurasian Economic Union, or companies just flat out lie about where these things are going to go. They're saying they're going to Kazakhstan and they fall off the drop of a lorry to Russia. China is redirecting a lot of its supply, right, to Russia of materials of concerns, most notably microelectronics, drones, through Central Asia. Central Asian trade with China has doubled since the war, right? So all of these supply chains and these export workarounds are very profitable for Central Asian companies, for many of the ruling families and their allies. So the war hasn't impacted them in the same way. And certainly it's, being forced to choose between the West and Russia is the last thing that these countries want to do, right? They want to partner with everyone. They see Russia as being there permanently, and a power that they have to manage. And same attitude towards China.
Georgia and Moldova?
Georgia and Moldova. So Georgia's an interesting case in that Georgian-U.S. relations were extremely close 2 decades ago, right? In fact, Georgians sent troops to Iraq. At some point, they were the third largest providers of reserve troops in Iraq. You had very close ties between the Bush White House, George W. Bush White House, and the administration of Mikhail Saakashvili. There was a gradual extrication of this closeness for various reasons, and the Georgia War in 2008, right, where really we could say that this is the first actual war in the post-Soviet space between Russia and what it considered to be a Western proxy. I say all this because one would have expected the Georgian government to be quite supportive of Ukraine, and in some ways they have been, and certainly the public has been. However, the Georgian government that was elected after the Saakashvili government, controlled by Bidzina Ivanishvili, has increasingly backed the Kremlin and also has used the kind of sort of social issues that you see the Kremlin funding in other parts of the world also to really get a hold of sort of Georgian politics. So the result is a public that's supportive of Ukraine, but a refusal to enact sanctions, and also a kind of, well, where were these sanctions in 2008 when we were invaded, right? We had this war and you didn't stick up for us. Why should we get rid of half of our wine industry, right, and a good chunk of our tourist industry now, right, in this kind of solidarity? Moldova, a slightly different story. They're on the front line. They have clearly made this war an existential choice in domestic politics. Recent parliamentary election saw the sort of pro-European wing that also wants to expedite European integration elected with a decisive majority, despite Russian interference and attempts to influence the election. So different postures in different places, but certainly it's a lot more complicated than having to pick sides. And in fact, if there's any lesson from the 2000s, it's that picking sides can land you in trouble.
I want to pursue this a little bit more, the question of how other parts of the world are responding not only to the war in Ukraine, the question of having to choose sides, but also how they see Europe's role. Rachel, you and I have gone regularly to the Rysina dialogue. I don't remember whether you were there right after the war broke out. Okay, so where everybody turned up to basically lobby. Well, also the Americans turned up and the Europeans turned up to lobby India basically to get on board. and the sanctions and the general condemnation of Russia. And it obviously listened and then said thanks, but that's not where we are. But the critique was bigger, wasn't it? It was sort of a comment not only about the U.S., but it was a comment about Europe's hypocrisy. We've had wars. Where have you been, Europe? This is your war, but it's not our war. Tell us your perspective. You're about to go to India, spend a year as a senior researcher, looking at Europe and India. How has, in your view, the war in Ukraine been seen by India, by other countries? How has it impacted, I guess, the perception of Europe from the global South? I know that's a big part of the world. It's a terrible term. There's too much complexity, but take the part that you'd like to.
Gosh, this is a tough one. First of all, I would say that India's relationship with Russia goes all the way back to India's history of non-alignment. It goes back to the Cold War. So there's deep ties there. And there has been a deep frustration in India, especially over the last few months, about this push to wean them off of Russian oil. And that frustration stems from the fact that when the full invasion started in early 2022, Europeans and American policymakers pushed India to buy more Russian oil so that it would stabilize oil prices around the world as Europe decreased the amount that it was purchasing. And so there's that. But there is also a sense of Western hypocrisy amongst Indian audiences. And I remember, and I'm sure you were here in the audience for this too, it was a year after the invasion, and the chairman of the Observer Research Foundation that hosts the Raisina Dialogue was on stage with Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, and they were talking about the war. And every time Foreign Minister Lavrov would come out with these very pro-Russian talking points, people in the audience would stand and clap. And there was a clear sort of division amongst the European and Americans in the audience, and many of the Indians in the audience who feel like they have been forced to take a side on a war that they have no interest in, that they are trying to stay out of, and that the Europeans and Americans are trying to, force them to take a side. And I think many countries in the global South sort of feel that way, that it's you either look east or you look west. And most countries have interests in both sides and don't want to be forced into that decision making, nor do they feel like they should have to make that decision because what's in it for them at the end of the day.
And the other context is it also came, as we all know, but one has to sort of remember, on the back of the post-COVID recovery, capital is more expensive, debt problems, the so-called poly crisis, and Western countries not standing up for the desperate needs of the global South. Yeah. So the problem of, the sovereignty norm wasn't enough in the end. It wasn't enough because, we know that India cares about sovereignty. We know that Russia cares about sovereignty. We know that China cares about sovereignty. The violation of sovereignty in Ukraine kind of wasn't enough to get everybody on the same page and on the same side. So before we come to the audience, I just want to ask, I just want to say 2 words, United States. And I kind of want to get each of you to give us your views on how the arrival of a new president, not so new now, the return of President Trump, who has had a very different view on America's commitment to Europe, to Ukraine. How has that, for the part of the story that you look at, how has that changed the equation, and where do you think it's going? So whether it's Germany, whether it's Europe as a whole, Central Asia, just whatever your insight is, I want to put the question, of the conversation about the U.S. right on the table before we come to the audience. Who wants to start?
You guys can start with that one.
Elena.
Let me try. I think it's been fundamental in the sense that for a long time there's been a bit of I wouldn't call it a muddling through, but a sort of fuzziness in the way that the relationship between the EU and the US, and also EU-NATO, which is a part of that on security and defense has been advancing. And in some ways, the arrival of President Trump and everything we saw in the run-up to the Hague summit, the NATO summit in The Hague, was a dance, a calibration of how this would look like. So I think President Trump's arrival, his position on burden sharing, burden shifting, and which was very transactional, and it sort of came with an ultimatum, as opposed to previous United States presidents, which have all been in favor of the EU taking on a bigger burden sharing part in the EU-NATO relationship. But there was never that sense of, if you don't do it, we will leave. And especially if you don't do it, we will leave while there is a war in Europe. So I think that pushed the Europeans to make that significant commitment to 5% defense spending that we saw in The Hague. So I think the biggest point of reference in Trump's arrival and how it's recalibrated that relationship is moving towards that commitment. And I think that also fits into the conversation about deterrence in a way, because in the conversation about EU and NATO and that recalibration in recent years, there's been a sort of underlying question: does the EU and does Europe have a role to play in deterrence? And of course, when it comes to nuclear deterrence, no. But when it comes to conventional deterrence, it's been a bit of again, we haven't really had the answer. As Europe moves to be more of a defense sector, does it have a role in that? And I think with the increase in the defense spending, I think with the gray zones and the hybrid tactics becoming part of warfare as we know it, and then there's a bigger space there for Europe to deter. And also even with the threat of US forces leaving, which has led to a huge debate on conscription and ramping up, and increasing conscription across EU member states, all of these are also deterring factors. So I think we've seen that narrative change also in part because of the arrival of a new president in the US, and of course the leadership in the EU. There's a lot of challenges ahead, but maybe just to close to say, now we've agreed on the 5%. The EU has committed to creating fiscal space of about 800 billion for the next 4 years for increased defense investments. That will open up space for the EU to cooperate more also with other actors that can contribute to the defense supply chain, because you talked about the global south, there's a number out there. So I think this is really changing the way things are going looking forward. But of course, not having that guarantee of security that comes from the United States, that is a fundamental identity shifting issue in transatlantic relations.
I think I would put it in even starker terms. I would argue that in the history books, the way how Europeans have in the last 10 years managed to need 2 invasions of Ukraine, 2014 and 2022, and 2 elections of Donald Trump, 2016 and 2024, in a 10 years period, to finally come to the conclusion that they need to do something for their own security and defense. I think this will go into the history books as dangerous negligence. And I think there are no other ways to put it, because one of the words that I can't hear anymore in European discourses is the word self-fulfilling prophecy. That was there in 2016. We can't prepare for a Trump presidency. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Now it's we can't prepare for a US abandonment, or it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Europeans looked at the first Trump term as a historical mistake. It's kind of a weird coincidence that happened, and assumed that US foreign policy would just go back to business as usual, and not seeing the structural shift in US foreign policy, which extends beyond presidencies and was actually taking place for a long time, I think has really been a dangerous mistake, and is also the reason why Europeans now are trying desperately to keep Trump in to buy time, because they can't tell their populations the truth that Europe is indefensible right now without the United States. And this is not something that can be fixed next year or the year after. But this will take a decade at least, and incredible defense spending that only Germany can finance these days, no other European country can. And so that proposition is really difficult to make. That's why everyone is trying to keep Trump in to buy time. And on the US role, I think I would almost say that it's right now for Europeans the best case scenario if the United States is just a transactional actor, right? I think it's I mean, everyone has accepted that the Trump team doesn't care about the history and the value of the NATO alliances. They see NATO at max as a power vehicle. It's kind of nice to be the leader of the most powerful alliance in the world. It doesn't mean that you actually really care about the principle of alliances. And I think in the worst case scenario of Europeans, it is not only an interest-based relationship with the Europeans, but there are two dangers that the United States will support liberalism in Europe, which has been a great concern, especially with the Vice President's speech at the Munich Security Conference in February this year, where he implicitly encouraged, for example, Germany to open the door to radical right-wing populism and populists in government. And the second big concern about the US role is that eventually the United States could treat NATO just the same way as they treat Ukraine right now and just become an arms dealer to NATO and to Ukraine, and basically saying, well, if anything happens, you can buy our weapons, but that's it. I'm not saying that this is going to happen, but I think these are two worst-case scenarios that Europeans have to prepare for, and not to say, oh, we can't prepare for that, otherwise it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah.
It is extraordinary, just one comment, and I'm going to come to you, Alex, how slow, there was Trump 1.0, as you rightly pointed out, but I again, where were we? I remember I was in the UK during that first term, and as we all know, the referendum on Brexit took place just a few months before the first election of President Trump, and it's hard to describe. I mean, we all watched it here from the outside. I watched it from the inside. The level of internal focus on just trying to figure out what the referendum meant and how it was going to be implemented, there was no time really to think about Donald Trump. And there was a sort of sense of as you said, that it would pass, that at some level things were still working normally, that it was bluster more than a real change in America's commitment to Europe. But there was just amazing amount of internal preoccupation. And I think that probably defined a lot of Europe. Alex.
Yeah, so I think for many other parts of the world, this is not a seismic shift. This is not the reverse 1989 moment that this is for Europe. And just briefly in Central Asia, they really like Trump, right? They like his style. They like the fact that he's transactional. They like the fact that they're doing business deals over energy, minerals, some of them even critical. They like even more that they're not being lectured on democracy and human rights, that they're not having these complex anti-corruption investigations going on for FCPA violations and so forth. What's not to like? And they especially like the promise, circling back to what we were talking about earlier, that dialing down the tensions between Russia and the US in the long run is actually good for them and their geopolitical positioning.
India used to like President Trump and the United States. Now, I'm sure you have a lot to say about Europe as well as India, but what is your take on the United States and what it's meant for Europe?
I mean, it's interesting because, first of all, Trump is not the first president to harp on Europeans for not spending enough. This goes all the way back to Eisenhower, who said that if Europeans don't spend more on defense, that it risks making a sucker out of Uncle Sam. So this goes back a very, very long time. Second, I would say that I think Biden deserves some criticism here for the message that he ran on during his campaign that America was back, because I think it ignored some very basic political headwinds that were happening, not just in the United States, but in various European countries as well, in terms of what people want in terms of the US-European relationship and US engagement in the world. And so I think that what happens now, there's a lot of frustration that there is a transactional approach to the US-European relationship. But the question I would ask to that is, what happens if we base our relationship on a set of shared values, which I think we have for many years? What happens when those values start to diverge, not just between the two sides across the Atlantic, but within countries as well? I think we want to make sure that there is a bit of transactionalism in terms of defense, in terms of buying and selling weapons, in terms of economic ties, in terms of energy, in terms of people-to-people connections. You could argue that all of those things are transactional, and some might say bad because we want to focus on the values. But I think in order to keep the relationship strong, you do want a little bit of transactionalism in it. And at the same time, you want to encourage the Europeans to get stronger as well, because I think an ally that is more able to stand on its own 2 feet is at the end of the day better for the United States.
A lot there, and I'm sure a lot in the audience. So we're going to turn to, if you could say your name, your affiliation, and keep your questions succinct. And I'm going to take a few at a time since we don't have a huge amount of time. And I'm going to let Anastasia help me here. Please, front row, and then we'll come over here. Sorry to throw you off direction of travel.
Hi, I'm Is it working? Yes. I'm Flavia Martins, and I would like to know, with the advancements in robotics and all the increase in defense budget, how far are we from having humanoid robots involved in the conflict? And do you think that we are prepared as Western countries and continents and everything for that to happen anytime soon?
Thank you. And the gentleman here in the middle.
Thank you. My name is Nashwan. I'm from the United Nations Foundation. My question is about Turkey. Within this geopolitical landscape, how do you see the future of the Turkish, European, and American relationships? And do you think what's happening in Ukraine on this field is affecting other field where Turkey is active, like the relationship with Iran, Syria, and East Mediterranean? Thank you.
Thank you. And I think we had one at the back, right? Anastasia, you're in charge. Thank you. Perfect.
Adam Gipolo, also a former emerging leader a few years ago, and a big fan of my friend Andy. Thanks for being here. My question is actually about the future of the American Republican Party in a post-Trump landscape, given MAGA in particular has become much more isolationist, and that's a top-down to bottom-up approach. What, if anything, are our NATO allies and our European allies doing to brief, educate, and otherwise engage members of the MAGA majority in both the House and the Senate, if anything? Thank you.
Excellent question. All three excellent questions. Okay, who wants to do Turkey, Alex Cooley?
I would say Turkey has brokered its overlapping relationships very pragmatically in this, right? It has not joined the sanctions regime, right? And so it is involved in oil re-export. It's involved in reflagging of Russian businesses, certain supply chains on the one hand. On the other hand, officially, it has very clearly supported Ukraine's territorial integrity, right? So you see this brokering type of dynamic. It also, in terms of, one regional conflict that I'm aware of, also took really advantage of this window to support its partner in Azerbaijan to resolve the Nagorno-Karabakh phenomenon in decisive fashion, right? And pretty much the world was looking elsewhere, right? When this happened quickly, decisively, and so forth. So I think Turkey, it has its hands across so many different potential conflicts and place of disagreement actually with Russia, but it has created these modes of vivendi, I would say, quite effectively to help manage them. So, yeah.
Who wants to weigh in on robotics? Or does anybody want to add to this on Turkey? No? Robotics? Please?
quickly respond with a view to the battlefield in Ukraine, which I think is the future of warfare. I mean, what we see happening in Ukraine these days is going to be how war will look like in the future. The battlefield in Ukraine is dominated by drones, by an incredible amount of drones, which I think is what comes closest to robotic warfare that we are seeing right now. But in terms of engineering, creativity, Ukraine is at the absolute top front of using any kind of automated warfare right now. And there's always been a joke going around that at some point Ukraine will not ask NATO whether it can become a NATO member, but NATO will ask whether it can join Ukraine. And that joke actually, to me, became really true when we had those 19 drones who entered Polish airspace and NATO scrambled to shoot at least some of those down. We have these discussions about drone walls in the European Union right now. NATO is not prepared for drone warfare. It has too expensive missiles to shoot down drones. It has not the sensors that it needs. It doesn't have the sort of newest technology to shoot down drones in a cheap way. I mean, a colleague once told me that she heard in Ukraine the most efficient way to shoot down drones instead of the missiles is actually just take a rifle. Right, so I mean, this is a huge challenge for NATO countries in the future. And it's obviously something that Russia knows is a challenge.
Thank you. Elena?
Yeah, just to add on to that, which I completely agree on. The war between Russia and Ukraine has been the first incident ever in history where we saw one of the battles be fought between drones. So there was no human hand in that. And that is really a shift in warfare as we know it, right? So there were no humans involved, drones versus drones. It's the first time ever. And this is, to me, you know, given the speed at which, especially the Ukrainian industry, is readapting its drones from input from the battlefield. We have the progress that is being made in drone technology at the moment in Ukraine, in the Ukrainian industry, it's 5 or 6 days. In 5 or 6 days, you have a more advanced drone than you had 6 days before in the Ukrainian industry. Why? Because they're testing on the battlefield and then they're integrating into factory. This is unprecedented speed of defense industrial development. And I think, you know, that means that we will see a huge shift in what can be done with AI and robotics because of this. Now, a couple of questions here, however, are the following. When you talk about humanoids and when you talk about that type of robotics, there we have an ethics question that is even bigger than the ones we are currently facing, which are already bigger. And how this gets integrated into the defense industrial cultures in different parts of the world, that may affect the way in which that kind of warfare is, and that kind of war technology is developed in Europe or in other parts of the world. We'll have an ethics question. We'll have a human control question. These are going to be huge issues we face going forward in warfare. And I think it could fragment the world even more because we do not have at the moment any multilateral body where we have agreement and buy-in by globally on how this should happen. So it could potentially be a huge challenge for the global and international community. So I think, we don't know how that is going, and it's a very risky question. And my sense is it would be very good and very helpful for the world to move forward towards some kind of multilateral arrangement on some baselines there, because it could go to places we do not want to see the world going.
And on Europeans engaging with MAGA, with the Republican Party, such as it is and may be in the next round, do you want to?
Yeah, just really quickly, I would say that Europeans have been, center-right and center-left Europeans have been making an effort to come to Washington and meet with MAGA Republicans, both on the Hill and in the administration as well. And they have people to meet with. For example, J.D. Vance had the pretty explosive Munich Security Conference speech in February, but then he came a few months later and opened their office in Washington, and it gave a much more conciliatory speech and said, I'm surprised that you guys invited me back here, and it was sort of like kumbaya. And so I think that's interesting. But what is also interesting is that you have right-wing political parties in Europe that are very much taking pages out of the MAGA playbook here in the U.S. And so while center left and center right politicians are coming to Washington, D.C. and meeting with folks, so are right wing politicians. And that's where I think conversations about, like general moral excesses of society, which is J.D. Vance's favorite topic, immigration, free speech, that's where those conversations take place. And that's where I think some of those values begin to align, and that we'll start to see more of that going forward.
And someday Europeans might perhaps even miss Donald Trump if J.D. Vance is president, because his views on Europe are even more stark and ideological, I would argue, than Donald Trump's views.
I think you're totally right. Yeah.
I want to take one more quick round, if I may. Somebody right there in the back, strong hand right up, and then we'll come to the gentleman in the front.
Good evening, Max Overholt. My question is, in Trump's second administration, would you say that that the attitudes basically in Europe have pretty much become kiss the ring and say, thank you, Godfather?
Oh, wow. So, and here in the front, and then we'll take one right back
I
there.
have a question. I have a question for James Cooley. He made very good, interesting comments about the sanctions not being enforceable in Central Asia. I think it's even beyond that. If I can ask this, is it also largely among the BRICS sanctions are not being enforced? And now you've got, just today, I haven't seen all the details of it, the latest round of U.S. sanctions on shipping of gas and other things. To what extent do you think these sanctions will be enforceable and bring Putin to the negotiating table?
And then a final question right here, and everybody can just take one. Use these questions to inform your final remarks. Thank you.
Tom Balderi, thank you for coming. We touched a little bit on the far-right parties, and I've read articles that said if the elections were held today, they may be victorious. If that does happen, how do you think that would affect the defense posture of Germany, France, and their defense spending and their overall attitude toward Russia?
And I would just add that there's somebody online who's asked to build on your question, whether you think the commitment's the 5%. We know it's a little bit of an accounting error, a round up 3.5 and 1.5, but in any case, do you think the 5% is going to be delivered on? Let's just sort of go down the line and take a question, but also give us your final kind of thoughts on this broad question of where Europe and Central Asia are going, given the war in Ukraine and the changes in the United States?
Well, the 5% is, we're going to see some pretty creative accounting come out of European capitals over the next few years. And I think that's something to watch closely. I give the Europeans a lot of credit for the NATO summit a few months ago, getting to the table and saying we are going to spend 3.5% of our GDPs on hard defense, 1.5% on things like reinforcing bridges and railroads and things like that. And so the steps are being taken in the right direction. My worry and my hope is that the wind remains in those sails, and that wherever political winds may blow, the Europeans understand that these are steps that need to be taken regardless of who is in the White House, whether it's a Europe-friendly administration or a Europe-skeptic administration. These are good steps for Europe and indeed for the U.S.-European relationship as well.
Thank you.
I think I'll also comment on the 5%, if I may. May I?
Of course.
Or should I take another one? So I completely agree. And I think there's spaces for that kind of accounting. So if we're very absolute about it, right now the EU has created sort of the necessary space through its own regulations to increase, as I said before, the collective defense spending by 800 billion in the next 4 years, which is about enough to take what the EU is spending now, which is almost 2% to 3.5%. So if you take the EU collectively, we could say 3.5% is probably a given, and the rest 1.5%, which is defined differently, I think it could come through that creative accounting. But we also have to forget that until 2 years ago, that 2% that had been committed to 10 years ago and 11, the EU hadn't reached it collectively. So I think that's it's not so important. The numbers are not that important. I think the important thing is what's going to be done with that and how it's going to work in the European space and in the transatlantic space. And on sanctions, I just wanted to thank you for bringing in the BRICS. We didn't talk about them. Probably we're not going to talk about them. But I think one thing that is important to say in this whole transatlantic discussion we've had in Ukraine, in parallel, and we didn't mention China a lot, but I think in parallel, there's been that minilateral space, which is actually becoming much bigger in very many ways, led by China, the BRICS that are increasing, the BRICS that enlarged. And that is a whole space of countries, of huge population, of growing GDP, where those sanctions are not enforced because they are not committed to those sanctions anyway. So I think this is creating a sort of bifurcation, if you might call it that way, of the global environment that is in ways that we know and don't know, impeding the effectiveness of everything that is being done in the transatlantic space.
I'm gonna have you hold only because I know Alex has to get to the airport, so I'm gonna let everybody finish. Leanna,
Okay,
don't be sorry.
quick. On the kissing the ring question, I really would not expect Europeans to, if you want that, to be the resistance to Donald Trump. And I know there has been a lot of criticism about Europeans selling out its soul to Donald Trump. I mean, there has been a discourse about humiliation in Europe itself too. But the problem is Europe is just so fundamentally and existentially dependent on the United States as a security provider that there is just no way, I mean, the way how I described it, how they can not try to keep Trump in at all costs, because if he doesn't remain in NATO, then Europeans are really like the emperor without clothes. I mean, it's as brutal as it is, right? So I think we have to keep that in mind to explain why there's not going to be a lot of standing up from the European perspective. And I think on the populism question, I think that's an important one. I think many right-wing populist parties in Europe are united by a feeling of appeasement towards Russia. I mean, that's the case not with Giorgia Meloni and the Brothers of Italy, but it's the case certainly with Le Pen in France. It's certainly the case with the right-wing radical AfD in Germany. But for me, the most concerning party is really the Alternative for Germany, the right-wing party in Germany, because they are combining appeasement with Russia with German militarization. So they want Germany to increase defense spending, but not for the EU or NATO to build collective security structures, but for Germany to be able, in a nationalistic way, to project power in Europe. And I think that is for the future of Europe a very dangerous combination. And lastly, I just want to underline very thickly what Elena just said, especially about China. China is the one reason why Russia is still able to continue the war against Ukraine in the way it does it right now. I mean, Central Asia, Georgia, and so on, but China is there and everyone else is there. And the alliance, and I would call it that way, between Russia and China is the reason why Russia can do this.
Yeah.
Alex.
I think one of the unexpected stories of the war was the reaction of the Western corporate sector in Russia, right? How they all pulled out really in the space of hours out of the space, not just consumers like IKEA and McDonald's, companies like ExxonMobil, BP, stranded billions of dollars worth of assets. Now, many of them being taken over because the stigmatization of Russia was so intense. We should not confuse the power of stigma, especially at the beginning of the war, with the power of sanctions. Right? The subsequent sanctions regime that came in place was a grand experiment, never sanctioned an economy nearly on the scale of Russia. And what have we seen? We've seen experimentation, the re-export I talked about. We've seen the creation of an offline shadow fleet. We've seen a whole series of swap arrangements with Gulf countries and energy producers, right? We've seen innovation in ordering arrangements to get out of sanctions. And I also want to underscore Elena's point. The penalty for sanctions evaders are listing by the Treasury, right? Some naming and shaming, but it's really secondary sanctions, right? Denying access, right? U.S. market, the financial system. That is a nuclear level kind of a sanction or remedy that's just not credible for most of these countries, right? You threaten Kyrgyzstan with secondary sanctions like, well, okay, we don't trade with you anyway. And this is where I think the arbitrariness of the tariffs comes in, right? Because the meme that Russia has pushed out is that the U.S. uses its dollar supremacy to arbitrarily sanction countries. It does so in a very kind of geopolitical way. And so this plays into this idea that there are some countries that get favors and certain countries that don't, right? And so these things are sort of interconnected. But the sanctions regime itself, I would say, has exposed some of these other broader fissures in global politics that we've alluded to.
There's a lot here. There's a lot more that we could discuss, but I would refer you to the writings of the people on the stage and also some of you in the audience. We have some real experts in the audience, I notice. So thank you so much for coming. Thanks to all of you for making the trip. You've all traveled for this. Yeah, join me in congratulating them.